All right, APers, 5.2, part 2. Let's get to our vocab. And our first word is Commodore Matthew Perry. So, Commodore Matthew Perry, he is most known and most important in world history as known as being the U.S. Navy Commodore who opens up Japan. How does Japan get opened up? Basically, what happens is Matthew Perry takes a steamship from the Navy with a force, brings it to Japan, and says that we want to trade with you. Japan is isolated before this, and then he says, no, really, we want to trade with you. I'm going to come back in the spring, and I want to hear you guys' answer. And basically with the implied threat of violence towards Japan if they don't cooperate. The Japanese are isolated, have not gone through the Industrial Revolution, so the steamship and everything that America has, it's kind of a bit scary for them. And they decide, which is really important, to actually realize that the United States, America, has better technology than them. They don't like Matthew Perry. Many of the pictures they make at the time show him as basically a furry white guy monster. And they show his steamship as kind of like a monster too at that time. So they don't like him necessarily, but they realize, hey, this new country, United States of America, they don't really know about too much. They have a lot of the steam power. They have a lot of technology. This is 1850, and Japan decides to industrialize and trade with the United States, which leads to the Meiji Restoration. This is very significant because this will put Japan on the path of industrialization, which is much different than its neighbor China, who basically does not industrialize and pays for it later on. This will move Japan industrialization and will actually make them a major power in Asia for many years, all the way up to World War II. So in the modern era and even beyond. And that's Commodore Matthew Perry, who's known for opening up Japan and helping cause them to go through the Industrial Revolution and the Meiji Restoration, which is their credit that they went through, that they did that. And they realized the Americans were powerful and they adapted their society. Tokugawa Japan. So Japan during the early modern era and the beginning of the modern era was under the Tokugawa shogunate, which basically you had the shogunate, who was right next to the emperor. Then you had the daimyos, who were kind of like the nobles in Japan, and the samurais, who were like the knights in Japan. And this was a government that was isolated. We can see the years there of existence, 1600 to 1867. And the samurais had a lot of power. They were gentlemen in the society. The Tokugawa shogunate brought them into the capital of Edo, the capital of Edo, which will become Tokyo. And basically this is the society that exists in the early modern and the beginning of the modern era until Commodore Matthew Perry comes and Japan goes through the Meiji Restoration and the samurais lose their power. This is significant because it shows what Japan was like before Matthew Perry, more of a feudal society. And it also shows us how much Japan is going to change quickly as they industrialize and then become a major power in Asia, which will last all the way up to World War II and actually beyond. I mean, Japan's seriously a major power today right now too. All right, let's get to our next term. The Meiji Restoration was the restoring of the Meiji Emperor. It ends the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. And here's a couple big things about it. It basically takes the power away from the samurais, the daimyo who existed in Japan during the Tokugawa shogunate. It's also when Japan decides that they're going to mix their society. They're going to keep many things from their own heritage, but they're going to take some things from the West, the United States and Europe, particularly the United States. After Commodore Matthew Perry comes, they industrialize under the Meiji Restoration, and they become pretty powerful, industrialized fast, and also change their military, change their economics. And during the Meiji Restoration, Japan becomes a dominant power in Asia. This is a contrast with China, who doesn't do this at this time, tries to industrialize during the self-strengthening movement. Then the empress and basically the bureaucracy get away from it, and China becomes weaker and basically is exploited and taken over by Britain and other European powers, where Japan, because they do industrialize and because they do change their military, they become the major power in Asia at the end of the modern era and into the contemporary era. And you can make the argument today that Japan is definitely still a major power in Asia today, even though they don't have a strong military today, like they did in the Meiji Restoration. Manifest destiny. This was the belief in the United States that God wanted European Americans to basically take over the continent of America, meaning North America at that time. It was the idea that basically the angel of liberty here was leading the settlers. Those would be basically the white settlers that we can see in a lot of this picture right here. Leading the white settlers, bringing all the progress, all the good things of industrialization. We got the telegraph here. We got the trains back here. And to do that, they were just going to have to, kick these other people who were already living on the land. We see the American Indians here basically getting kicked off their way of life with the buffalo there. Manifest destiny leads to the United States taking over the country that we have today, leads to the Mexican-American War, where the United States basically steals land from Mexico in the 1840s, 1850s. And it's the idea that God has destined basically white Americans to take over the land, and that's what he wants to do. Remember, at this time, people didn't understand diseases like smallpox that were going on and killing much of the native population, and that led them to think that, well, God wants us to have this land. That's why it's so empty and clear. It's a pretty racist point of view. Any way you look at it today, it's extremely racist. Hugely significant, because this leads to the United States of America gaining more land, more resources, and becoming the power in what would be considered the Western Hemisphere or in the Americas, and kind of ruling over the rest of the Americas and watching over them is pretty much what happens. Let's get to our next word. The Monroe Doctrine was created in the modern era. It is basically the idea that the United States' sphere of influence, or where the United States have the most influence, is the Americas. It's basically the United States saying to European powers, stay out of the Americas, this is our territory. That the United States should have influence with their businesses, like the United Fruit Company. It doesn't mean the United States is going to take over all this land, but it means the United States is going to have influence in there. United States companies are going to go in there, and basically that the Americas are off limits, and this is the United States area of influence. The United States basically says to Europe, do what you want with Africa, do what you want with Asia, but stay out of the Americas. Definitely this is influential in the Spanish-American War. The United States takes land from Spain, lets some people be free, and others they continue to take over. And basically what we see here is that the United States will have influence in here. It usually won't be outright imperialism where the United States takes over a country, but there will be the United States interfering with governments of Latin America, and in many cases having their industries come in and taking the natural resources. And a big example of that would be the United Fruit Company, which we talked about in the last packet. The Mexican-American War also happens during our modern era, and what we basically see here in the mid-1800s is that we have an area of Texas where a lot of this starts, where many people from the United States move into Texas, and actually more people from the United States live in Texas than Mexicans. And what happens is Mexico's a young country. It just recently got its independence from Spain, and it's trying to fill out its territory, so it invites Americans to immigrate into Mexico. Yes, you heard that right. Americans immigrating into Mexico. So many Americans cross this line. There was no wall or anything. They cross this line and immigrate into Mexico, and they live there. The only rule is they have to follow Mexican laws, honor Mexico as a country because they are, guest workers living in Mexico at this time. And Mexico also has a law against slavery. They don't allow slavery in their territories. Most of the people who come are Southerners at this time who do have slaves, and they bring slaves in. This leads to conflicts between Americans coming in, and also the Mexican government, which eventually will lead to a war in Texas, where Texas for a short period of time becomes its own little independent country, but eventually Texas will want to become part of the United States. Mexico suspects this the whole time, And then there's a conflict. The United States offers to buy basically this territory from Mexico. Mexico says, no, thank you, we'd rather keep our territory. And then it leads to a conflict where the United States goes to war, gets all the way to Mexico City, and takes this territory right here, all that green territory, and that becomes part of the United States. So all of this used to be Mexico, but the United States took it. So it was real dangerous when the American immigrants came into Mexico and then stole their land from them. That's basically what happens in the Mexican-American War. Significant? That's pretty significant. If you look at California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming are now all part of the United States that they get with manifest destiny mindset. And they have more territory, more resources. I mean, California and Texas have pretty valuable land. And this will cause the United States to become more powerful, and also shows that the United States is willing to engage in some imperialism and taking some land, just like Europe at this time. The Cherokee Nation, this is a group of American Indians who were very strong, who were able to gain large parts of territory over here, over many other American Indian groups. So it was a very strong group. This nation, Cherokee, was unique too because they saw that basically white Americans were living here, and they adapted a lot of white American lifestyle. They had schools, they had their language, which is written language, and they adapted many cultural elements of the United States, but also kept a lot of their own indigenous culture, the fusion, basically. So what happened was, basically, the Cherokee did everything that American Indians were supposed to do. They adapted many ways that the Americans lived at this time, but they also kept their traditions. But what happened was eventually none of this would mean anything as Andrew Jackson, President of the United States, kicks them out of their land because they want to give this land to white settlers. This leads to what is called the Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee are forcibly moved and are made to go all the way from their homeland, which is in the southeast United States, to Oklahoma. This picture is a pretty accurate representation, and this one too, because the Cherokee, oftentimes you see pictures of them like riding on horses. For the most part, they had to walk. The horses took the supplies. So the Cherokee had to walk. Where they had to walk from? They had to walk all the way from our areas in Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and they made them go all the way to Oklahoma to relocate them in a new land, which has a totally different lifestyle, a totally different land for them to live on. Thousands and thousands die on this, and we see basically the United States with the idea of manifest destiny. The significance here for both Trail of Tears and Cherokee is that manifest destiny is basically about white Europeans wanting to take the land. That's what it's really about. And even if a group like the Cherokee makes accommodations and tries to live with the European Americans who are there, they won't be accepted because they're different, because they look different, and because they are a different people. So it's very significant that this idea of manifest destiny is basically for European Americans and not for others. That is the Trail of Tears, and that's what we see during the modern era. Another example of manifest destiny, the United States showing imperialism as they're moving people off their homeland further west. Let's do a 2-for-1 here. Zulu Nation and Shaka Zulu. The Zulu Nation were from southern Africa, South Africa today, and they were a nation of people who were able to militarily defeat their neighbors, defeat their rivals, and form a very large nation of warriors. Basically, the other nations in Africa had to become Zulu, get exiled, or be killed. Very good military warriors. You can compare them to the Spartans in a sense. You could also compare them to the Mongols. They were also very much engaged in trade with the Europeans who were there. So they were engaged in trade with the Europeans, other people, and Shaka Zulu was their leader. So Shaka Zulu is the leader of the Zulu. He's an amazing warrior who's able to expand their territory. He's also quite a bit brutal too, especially to other people who oppose him. He will kill other people to get his territory. Again, think the Mongols. They expand territory, they expand trade, but there's also a cost to it too. Now, the Zulu are also known because they resist the Europeans who are in South Africa. They first have a war against the Dutch at the Battle of Blood River, where they are defeated and more of their land is taken. They are able to put up a resistance against the British and defeat them in a major battle. However, eventually the Zulus' land is taken away by the British, and the British discover gold and diamonds and start taking more land. They're significant, though, because they show a resistance to imperialism that existed in this time period.